Anlaşılabilirlik sezgisi teizm için bir delil midir?
Does the intelligibility intuition point to theism?
Well, first I want to reiterate that I'm very grateful to be interviewed by you today and for this opportunity to talk a little bit about my research. So your question was, does the intelligibility intuition point towards God? So before answering that question, I need to clarify, well, what the intelligibility intuition is. So when we reason, when we experience the world and we form beliefs about the world, we infer beliefs about the world, we navigate the world of our minds and we form beliefs. We use various methods. One of the methods that we use to form beliefs is deductive reasoning. That's where you sort of argue in a way that the premises of your argument kind of guarantees your conclusion. But there's other ways of reasoning, and one of those is what's known as inference to the best explanation. It's also known as abductive reasoning, or simply abduction. And, those words can sound a little bit fancy, but really, we use abduction or inference to the best explanation all the time. And here's the way it works. Here's a classic example, right? You wake up in the morning, you see that the cheese that you left on the table has disappeared. You see little dark pellets on the floor, right? And then you remember from yesterday while you were in bed the night before, you remember little squeaky noises. So yeah, you ask yourself, well, what's the best explanation of that evidence, right? And then you look at different possibilities. One of your possibilities might be that, well, maybe my wife or my spouse decided to pull a prank on me and did all of those things. Maybe that's what caused my evidence. Or maybe aliens did it, right? Or maybe God did it. Or maybe it was just mice, right? Mice in your house. And you look at all the different explanations and you figure out, well, which one is the best, right? As in which one makes most sense of the evidence, right? And once you've picked the best one, in this case, obviously, mice are the best explanation for all the evidence that you can see. You conclude that that the best explanation is the true explanation, right? So not only is it the case that the existence of mice would best explain your evidence, it's also the case that there actually are mice, right? The mouse hypothesis, the mouse theory is true, right? So, as should be fairly evident by now, inference to the best explanation is a kind of reasoning that we use all the time. We use it in everyday cases, everyday life, but it's also really, really important in science, right? Because when you do science, you deal with that which is unobservable, at least not directly. You can't directly observe things like molecular structure, atoms, genes, and all of those things that scientists tell us about. You can't directly observe them. So if you're going to form theories about them, you're going to have to use some kind of inference. And the inference that scientists use generally is inference to the best explanation, right? So that's all well and good. But the thing with inference to the best explanation is that it comes with assumptions, right? You need to make when you engage in that kind of reasoning, you need to make an assumption about the universe, namely that it's intelligible. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that the kind of world in which we live is the kind of world where things generally have explanations. It's not generally the case that things happen for no reason, right? That it's not the kind of world where you could probably have all that evidence with, the bits of cheese disappearing, the squeaky noises, and the pellets on the floor, and that doesn't have an explanation, right? It would be really strange if you were having a debate about something. Debate with someone, and you were trying to convince them of your theory. And you were saying, well, look, my theory is the best explanation. And the person responded to you, you know what? I agree, it is the best explanation, but maybe there is no explanation, right? Just because it's the best doesn't make it true. That would be quite a strange thing to answer. But that answer would essentially, how should I put this, highlight the fact that when you run an inference to the best explanation, you presuppose, you assume that the world has explanations in it, that generally facts in the universe have explanations, right? They're intelligible in that sense, right? Now, then the question is, well, where does that assumption come from, right? Where do we get it from? Where do we get the belief that the world is intelligible? Now, you might say we get it from science, right? Science unravels the world to us or uncovers it for us. Science reveals the world to us, and the world that science tells us about is a world where, things generally have explanations. But of course, that wouldn't really work because science itself, right, uses inference to the best explanation. Science relies on inference to the best explanation. Therefore, science itself needs to presuppose the intelligibility belief, right? In order to even begin to do science in the first place, you have to have that assumption, right, in the back of your mind. Maybe you're not conscious of it. It doesn't matter. It's still there, right? So you still assume that the world is intelligible. So that still leaves us with the question, doesn't it? Where does the intelligibility belief come from, if not from science? Well, the most plausible answer, both on a common sense level and also on the level of cognitive science, actually, is to say that it's an innate intuition, right? It's something that we just know, right? It's something that we are, if not born with, at least born with a disposition to believe. And when you think about it, if you have children or if you interact with children, what do? They always ask why all the time. Why this? Why that? Why this? Now, they wouldn't do that unless they thought there was an answer to that question. And if you say, well, that's just because there's no answer, they're very unsatisfied, right? So it looks as though we have this innate, inbuilt, hardwired, if you prefer that, intuition. We are naturally disposed to expect the world to be intelligible. That's what I call the intelligibility intuition in that paper, which you mentioned earlier. Now, what do you do with that intuition? And is it trustworthy? Should we believe in it? Should we trust this intuition? Is it true? And how do we know that it's true? Well, there's various approaches to that question. But one way of thinking about it is to think about whether the intuition is formed in a way that makes it knowledge. I guess that's the question that we need to ask ourselves, isn't it? This intuition, this innate inbuilt intuition that the world is intelligible, is it a form of knowledge or is it just a belief, right? Do we actually know that the world is intelligible? When you think about it, the stakes are pretty high, because if we don't know, then science falls apart, right? Because science depends on this. Now, as I argue in that paper, the answer to the question, do we know this or not, depends on your background worldview. So there's two worldviews that I'm interested in today for the purposes of today. One is the naturalist worldview. The other is the theistic worldview. Right? Of course, there's many different kinds of naturalism and there's many different kinds of theism, as you know. But for the sake of today, we're just going to consider those two without going into too much detail. So what does naturalism say? Naturalism says that reality is exhausted by natural. Everything that exists is natural. How you define natural is kind of another story. There's various answers to that. One might be just the physical, whatever is within space-time, or just, whatever exists is the kind of thing that science tells us about, natural entities. So, everything either is physical or natural or reduces to the natural in some sense. And I guess one fairly straightforward implication of that is that the human mind, with all its innate intuitions, is the product of a purely naturalistic process. There's no kind of supernatural, theistic, divine being behind the process. The natural system is, as it were, self-sufficient or even maybe self-explanatory. So our minds are the product of evolution, biological evolution, and there isn't really anything else to the story. So that means that this innate intuition, the intelligibility intuition, is itself the product of evolutionary theory. Now, why is that a problem, or is it a problem? Well, you need to think about the way in which evolutionary theory works. Evolutionary theory, well, there's two parts to it. One is like the random generation of new traits. The other is selection, right? Traits are selected by natural selection on the basis of the extent to which they favor reproductive fitness or not, whether they help you, the animal, the organism, to survive and pass on your genes, right? In other words, on the basis of their usefulness to your fitness, to your survival and reproduction. Now, say naturalism is true and the intelligibility intuition is purely the product of naturalistic evolution. So presumably selection would have had something to do with the appearance of the intelligibility intuition. The question is then, well, why? Why did evolution give us this intuition? Why? Lots of possible answers. You might say it's random. There are many aspects of evolution that are random, fair enough. Or it might have been selected by evolution to fulfill some function, right? To help us to navigate our prehistoric environments, because that's when we evolved, right? We're talking, a very, very long time ago. What you can't say is that evolution gave us the intelligibility intuition because it's true. Right? I'll repeat that because it's really important. You can't say that evolution gave us the intelligibility intuition because it's true. It's not the case that the intuition was selected for its truth. And the reason for that is that the intelligibility intuition is an intuition about the entire universe, right? About the structure of the universe. Now, in terms of survival and reproduction, you might need to know some pretty basic things like, what kinds of plants are poisonous, what kinds of animals are dangerous, so you don't get eaten and you don't die, and things like that. You don't want to fall into ditches. But you certainly don't need to know a deep truth about the structure of the universe in order to survive and reproduce, right? I mean, just look around you, look at animals, organisms, cockroaches, etc. Most organisms in the world don't have any, beliefs at all, and certainly no beliefs about the deep structure of the universe. And it's very difficult to see why it would be useful to prehistoric hominins to know about the deep structure of the universe, to know that everything, from the infinitely small to the infinitely large, is intelligible in the sense that I explained, right? So if naturalism is true, we don't have the intelligibility intuition because of its truth, right? In other words, the truth of the intelligibility intuition is not part of the explanation of why we have it. You might think, well, so what? Who cares? Well, a lot of philosophers, myself included, think that generally speaking, for a belief to count as knowledge, it has to be the case that there's a connection, a causal connection between the belief and that which the belief is about. So, for example, if I believe that there's a cat on the mat, it has to be, for that belief to be knowledge, it has to be that the cat on the mat causes me to believe that there's a cat on the mat. If, for example, I believe that there's a cat on the mat because I took, a mushroom, like a magic mushroom that gives me hallucinations, and it formed the belief in me that there is a cat on the mat. I'm hallucinating the cat on the mat. Yeah. That's not knowledge, right? Even if there actually is a cat on the mat, right? So there needs to be the right kind of causal connection between my belief in the cat on the mat and the cat on the mat. Similarly, with the intelligibility of the world, for it to be knowledge, for us to know that that the world is intelligible, it needs to be the case that I believe that the world is intelligible because it is in fact the case that the world is intelligible. The intelligibility of the world has to cause my belief that the world is intelligible. But we've already just seen that based on naturalism, right? Naturalism entails That's not possible. That did not happen, right? We don't have the intelligibility intuition because it's true. We have it either for random reasons or because it was kind of useful, right, to help us navigate our environments. We don't have it because it's true, which means that if naturalism is true, we do not know that the world is intelligible, right? We can't know it. And if we can't know that the world is intelligible, then it's not rational to rely on inference to the best explanation, because inference to the best explanation depends on the belief that the world is intelligible. And if we can't rationally rely on inference to the best explanation, we can't do science either, because science depends on inference to the best explanation. The philosopher Ernest Macmillan went as far as to say that inference to the best explanation is the inference that makes science, right? It's central to science. So if naturalism is true, then we can't rely on science. That's a bit of a problem because, well, it's a problem because most of us do want to rely on science. And even leaving that aside, naturalism itself, if you listen to naturalistic philosophers, many of them, if not most of them, or even all of them, will say that they base their naturalistic argument, their naturalistic position, on science. They think that naturalism is the worldview that's best supported by science. It's a bit ironic then if naturalism forces you to give up on science. It might even mean that naturalism is self-defeating because naturalism depends on science, but naturalism means that you can't rely on science anymore. So the thing that was supposed to support naturalism turns out to not be trustworthy on naturalism, self-defeating, self-undermining. Now, I've mentioned that there were two worldviews that we're going to think about today. I've already described naturalism. The other one is what you might call traditional theism, maybe even classical theism or just standard theism. The worldview says that you have the natural universe, it exists, but you also have God, right? And you can define God for our purposes as a being that transcends the physical universe and who is the causal source of the physical universe, right? And who intentionally brings about the world into being, sustains it into being, if you like that better. Now, the question is, do we have the same problem on theism? And well, let's think about it. God creates the universe. God creates minds as well, your mind and my mind. Maybe he uses evolution to do that, even evolution by natural selection. Doesn't really matter for our purposes, right? Theism is compatible with evolutionary theory. But the point is, if you're a theist, if you believe in God, then you think, even if you are a believer in evolution, right? You think, well, evolutionary theory isn't everything to the explanation of my mind and why it is the way it is, why it has what it has. You think, well, maybe there's an evolutionary process that shaped my mind, but that process ultimately comes from God. And that makes it possible for you to say that you have the innate intuitions that you have because God wanted you to have those particular intuitions about the structure of the universe, including the intelligibility intuition, which then enables you to go on to say that God gave you the intelligibility intuition because it's true, right? Because the world actually is intelligible, because God ensured that the world was intelligible. God wanted to create a world that made sense. And God wanted to create human beings who were capable of recognizing that, right? Who were capable of innately knowing that. So you don't have the same problem, because now we do have the causal connection between the intelligibility intuition on one hand, the belief that the world's intelligible, and the fact that the world actually is intelligible. Meaning that on theism, traditional theism as I've defined it, I believe that the world is intelligible because it's actually true that the world is intelligible. So the causal connection is there, meaning that we can know that the world is intelligible, meaning that we can rely on inference to the best explanation, meaning that we can rely on science. So naturalism threatens inference the best explanation, and therefore science. Theism doesn't. That's the crux of the argument. Now, what follows from this? Well, at the very least, I wouldn't say that this is a direct proof for God's existence. I would say that it's a reason to favor theism over naturalism. I'm going to put it very childishly. If you think of philosophy of religion and debates about God as like a point scoring exercise, right, where you can get 1 point for theism and 1 point for team naturalism, I would say that this argument that I've just laid out for you this evening is a point for theism. It's a reason. It might not be decisive, because you have to consider everything else, but it's a reason to consider theism as being a more plausible philosophical worldview than naturalism.